Endeavors of the whole humankind have grown by today to global dimensions. To make sense of all this activity, I draw understanding from thermodynamics as it is summarized by the book Back to Reality, a revision of the scientific worldview. According to thermodynamic theory, the questions, where do we come from, what are we, where are we going, recapped by French artist Paul Gauguin, are not only elusive philosophical problems, but addressable in practice. The comprehensive perspective on our past, present, and prospects opens up when we understand that everything that exists comprises quanta and all processes are flows of quanta. From this vantage point, we see human impact on the Earth's geosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, and biosphere in a comprehensive manner. Even though we have become more aware of the global ramifications of our way of life, it seems as if we are in for only new troubles. Since changes seem hard to master, let us ask why the world is changing in the first place. According to thermodynamics, forces cause changes. We have freed forces from those deposited in fossil fuels, all the way down to those bound in the atomic nucleus. This release of free energy has set our way of life on a collision course with a grander reality, where the natural forces on a planetary scale are now counteracting our global impact. Human activity is unprecedented but not extraordinary. While the scale of our influence is global, our pursuits follow the same principle as other processes. Urban areas expand in the same way as species spread. Transport, energy, and transmission networks and information networks disperse just as trees and shrubs sprout new branches. Our organizations assemble themselves as other hierarchical systems do. Even our omniscient endeavors in all their enormity display the grand regularity. Wars break out like forest fires. Skirmishes, flare-ups burst out from time to time, while world wars are as rare as walloping wildfires. Data reveal nothing unique in human undertakings. After all, how could humans possibly bypass the universal law of nature? The magnitude of human impact isn't exceptional either. Natural disasters too, such as earthquakes, large meteorites, and volcanic eruptions bring about global changes abruptly. The biggest forces cause the widest and swiftest changes. The massive power in the hands of modern people makes things happen fast. That is not a problem in itself. For example, when ozone layer depletion was noticed, its causes were investigated and mitigated. Likewise, the acidification of lakes caused by emission of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide was brought to halt, and today the waters are recovering. However, now plastics pollute the oceans, some raw materials are running short, the planet is warming up. What's going to wax and wane next? We tackle the problems we cause. That says a lot about our short-sightedness. Our measures ought to be proactive rather than reactive. We tend to consider ourselves unique. We imagine living in a world of our own because our colossal consumption of fuels detaches us from the whole. So we interpret economic activity as behavior of agents with their preferences and biases, while in the data, nothing in our doing seems to stand out of the ordinary. In one way or another, we merely aim for balance with the surrounding resources. Not a moment too soon, we need a worldview that covers more than the world of human affairs in order to take a course consonant with the planetary forces of nature toward sustainable balance. Rather than looking for the causes of the destruction of natural habitats in ourselves, let us examine our activity as a natural process to recognize the universal law in ourselves and thereby appreciate the need to do things differently. Also, cormorants and shaks, for instance, those widespread aquatic birds, fish wherever they can. The flock grows until the carrying capacity of the environment is reached, and if exceeded, the population collapses. Why would human activity follow some other law or eventually follow none. Our blindness to reality is apparent in our theories about behavior and economics, as well as in our outlook of culture and values. For us to live more meaningfully, we ought to understand what values are in their essence. Thermodynamics is in character a worldview, rather than, say, a mathematical model of society for political interpretation. The theory explains what society is all about, rather than what it should be like. We should ask, for example, why societal distributions are skewed, instead of arguing for a wide or narrow distribution of income. The answer lies in understanding that society is a system which does not evolve toward a high or low degree of skew as such, but toward balance. We should likewise inquire why the economy grows or declines, rather than seeking growth or eventually arguing for downsizing. The answer lies in understanding that society does not develop or downshift as such, but diminishes imbalance in one way or another. Moreover, we should examine how equality or inequality lessens the imbalance, rather than presumptively striving for equality or perhaps supporting inequality, because rights are not values as such, but mechanisms that serve motion toward balance. Furthermore, we should focus on forces that drive the economy in one way or another, rather than arguing that economic success stems from, for instance, secularism or traditional labor ethics, because a way of life is in the service of forces. Thermodynamics allows us to see the root cause of things.
Why do cultures flourish and fade?
The American anthropologist Marvin Harris saw habits, traditions, and taboos as means for a community to survive in its environment. Materialism views culture as a response to natural environment, as well as to technological and economic circumstances. Although the thermodynamic theory arrives at the similar conclusions as those of cultural materialism, only now can we unambiguously see that culture sources from the foundations of our existence. Culture is a way of making living. It is a mechanism that conveys flows of quanta, that is, makes things happen. The ubiquitous patterns, the grand regularity, justifies the drawing of parallels. The means for a community to persist are encoded in culture in the same way as organism's phenotype represents the features it needs to survive. The deterioration of living conditions will cause contemporary cultures to collapse, just as the past civilization perished. While we recognize, for instance, migration as a consequence of changing circumstances, we also need insight into the root causes. As the Finnish philosopher and sociologist Edward Westermarck declared in his inaugurational speech at the London School of Economics in 1907, the object of every science is not only to describe, but also to explain the facts with which it is concerned, and the object of sociology is to explain the social phenomena, to find their causes, to show how and why they have come into existence. Especially when only little is seen of the whole, a unifying theory is needed. One time the archaic means of living faded away. Today's communities are fighting for their existence as standard jobs are going away. Flows of quanta shape the society in the same way as rays of sunlight structure an ecosystem. Networks of energy-intense cities are dense just as the food webs are rich in tropical rainforest. Conversely, job opportunities are few and far apart in outback, just as vegetation is scant in the Arctic. Only by steadily drawing from vast resources can we attain an enduring high-level balance. Eventually, the whole humankind will wane away without power, just as a plant wilts without light. We usually think that energy is produced for us, which is true, but we tend to overlook the fact that it's the energy differences that drive us to use the fossil fuels and to harvest sunlight in the first place. Expressing our ultimate motives by universal principle, we can understand ourselves better. This portrayal of humankind in its habitat in terms of energy and time is essentially the same as the anthropological narrative of the individual in a society. People live both in the natural world and in the worlds of their own making, own imagination. Harris argued that in the olden days, taboos were efficient means for guiding people to live sustainably. In our time, worldviews are no longer passed on as religious beliefs and cultural bans, but perhaps as scientific canons. Either way, when our concepts are down to earth, we are in a contact with the bedrock of our existence. Then our worldview is consistent with our experience and we are able to reason instead of just believing. The 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes already society as a manifestation of natural laws. Mechanical philosophy can be related to thermodynamics such that different ideologies are seen to represent various forces. At its best, our culture is able to consume a variety of forces. Then society functions in a versatile manner, like an ecosystem with a diversity of species. Social physics, the tenet that regards society as a physical system, paved the way for statistical physics, not the other way around. Formulating velocity distribution of gas molecules, Maxwell adopted a random, symmetrical, rather than causally skewed distribution from Adolphe Quetelet. The Belgian astronomer, statistician, and sociologist had modeled distribution in societies with a bell curve. Boltzmann, too, drew a parallel between motions of particle and people. From this historical perspective, we see that the bold 19th century attempt to derive thermodynamics from core principles failed because statistical mechanics sprang from modeling data as if it had resulted from stochastic rather than causal processes. When we recognize that culture complies with thermodynamics, we come to see, for example, that a community may retain as much of its original culture as is permitted by self-sufficiency and isolation. Habits are its means to make things happen. For instance, the handshake is a common way to start communicating, just as a data transfer protocol opens communication between machines. These and other conventions change when circumstances change. Species evolve in response to changing environment. Supply of goods shifts in response to demand, and practices change in response, for example, to an epidemic. When people first harnessed flows of solar energy captured by plants for their use, their identity changed along with a transformed way of life. A farmer depends on surroundings in a different way than a hunter-gatherer. When fossil fuels were tapped, humans moved yet further away from their natural habitat, but we are in for balance one way or another. The anthroposphere is seeking a new planetary balance as the world economy contests with the power of the biosphere. However, in the long run, we can hardly compete with the powers of the atmosphere, geosphere, and hydrosphere. A changing climate exhausts our endeavors as rising sea level drowns our cities and rain clouds fail to form over our fields. Even if social physics does not advise us exactly what to do and what not to do in a given situation, it gives us grounds to analyze our choices. At any rate, evolution is on its way toward balance. So it is not about whether we can benefit from the changes, but whether we can bear them.
What is the purpose of the economy?
Economic activity meets human needs, so they say. Economic focuses on humankind by claiming that our endless needs are boosting economic growth. However, there are hardly any grounds to imagine that we are unique in our aspirations, as our accomplishments too display the grand regularity. By all appearances, the ubiquitous patterns imply that the economy complies with more general laws than the specific laws of economics. The conclusion could not be any different, given that everything comprises quantum. What is the invisible hand, coined by the economist Adam Smith? What, if anything, guides an individual's vested interest for the benefit of the common good. Do competitors organize themselves in the synergistic world economy in the same way as rivaling species structure in the symbiotic system? Is economic development weeding out agents in the same principle of natural selection as evolution is pruning out species? Does the process ultimately lead to the cooperative system of the whole Earth, known as Gaia? The similarity between ecology and economic activity is encapsulated in the words themselves. Eco comes from the Greek oikos, meaning family or household. The idea of their being ungirded by one and the same process is old. Darwin himself got the idea of survival when reading the tome, An Essay on the Principle of Population, 1798, by Thomas Malthus, an English demographer and economist. Contemporary economics has in turn inherited many ideas and concepts from biology. Innovations and competitions are seen to propel economic growth in the same way as viable mutations and the struggle of existence are seen to drive the evolution of species. Diversity is desirable in an economy like in the ecosystem because an array of agents can, just as a spectrum of species, can seize the opportunities and prevent setbacks. By contrast, monocultures in both commerce and agriculture are nearly incompetent at progressing and predisposed to disasters. In thermodynamic terms, a wide distribution of mechanisms can consume various sources of free energy, whereas a narrow one can tap only a few resources. The Enlightenment philosopher Andreas Chydenius is known as a sharp-eyed visionary from his main work National Gain, 1765. His thesis shares the hallmarks of thermodynamics. A prime example is that the course of events cannot be dictated from above because causal relationships are non-deterministic. In other words, the command economy does not work, as it is impossible to know in advance how to command. It is thus better to increase a freedom of choice. That paradoxically requires restrictions. Regulations prohibit, among other things, monopoles, cartels, and the use of insider information to ensure diversity in making things happen. Laws also protect property, infrastructure, and capital in order to secure means for making things happen. A restriction for a few is thus a construction for most, just as a city wall protects numerous transactions and a cell wall various reactions. Following Chydenius, David Ricardo and Adam Smith wondered what the process of early industrialization in England was all about. Since the late 18th century, economic growth has produced products in the most varied forms, but by now many of them have fallen into disuse, been dumped, or ended up on the shelves of the museums. All kinds of goods were produced only a short while ago, but the integration of the global economy narrowed the diversity into cost-effective standardized product lines. Similarly, as documented by Cambrian fossils found in Burgess Shale, a great variety of early organisms suddenly emerged about 500 million years ago, but soon narrowed into lineages of thriving species. Is this universal least-time consumption of free energy by ever more efficient manufacturing what we mistake for our unique rationality? It is easy to demonstrate that the most well-known laws of economics, such as the law of supply and demand and the law of diminishing returns, are manifestations of evolution toward a balance. It just requires us to state the economic factors, raw materials, products, machines, works of etc. in the universal units of energy and time, that is quanta. In this way, the thermodynamic theory gives a more comprehensive view of economic activity than economics. The dynamics of society is like that of any other system. Market forces are forces like any other. Expressing economics with the terminology of physics is nothing new. In the late 19th century, Léon Walras explained that demand and supply meet at balance. The French economist described the course of events aptly as cropping, French tâtonnement. the dynamic balance between supply and demand is sought somewhat blindly, as it cannot be known beforehand or predicted accurately. Indeed, economies are capricious. Frederick Soddy, in turn, offered thermodynamics as the foundations for economics in the 1920s and 1930s, but the Nobel Prize-winning chemist was roundly dismissed as a crank. At that time, Soddy's ideas were radical. Today, they are routine. The gold standard is gone. Currencies are floating. Economic cycles are balanced by the government surpluses and deficits. Consumer price index serves to measure the state of economy. Banks are required to keep minimum reserves. We are beginning to understand that we could act in a more meaningful way by considering the global economy as a part of the natural economy of Earth. That's why we have begun to talk about ecosystem services and natural capital. Even better would be to price everything in energy and time instead of money. The budget would be realistic, for such a calculation would make evident the forces of nature on the planetary scale. Economists are berated for making false predictions. Indeed, it seems strange that even the most developed economies experience unexpected swings. Paradoxically, the high degree of development is the very reason for the capricious character of modernity. Efficient mechanisms such as stock exchange and the means of free communications mediate changes in value almost instantaneously. When a change is abrupt, the driving forces also change suddenly, which affects the ensuing change. Changes beget changes. In a similar manner, the forces and counterforces compete when a fishing line float bounces for a while, or when a chemical reaction oscillates for some time, or when a light flashes for a split second after laser has been turned on. The data are similar. They can be modeled with similar equations. The course of oscillations is also trivial. The system follows a great force with high speed, and thus the reaction to the action overshoots the balance point. While oscillations can be dramatic, they are not random. The event at hand follows from all the previous ones and not deterministically only from the initial state. In its all turbulence, the intricate courses of events does not follow from the system's hair-trigger sensitivity to the initial conditions, as is assumed in chaos theory. Slight initial differences do not bloom out into enormous diversity of possible outcomes. The flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil does not cause a tornado in Texas, but the temperature difference between the warm ocean and the cold upper atmosphere. Complexity is not per se the reason why predictions do not pan out. That is the interdependence of causes and consequences. There's hardly any point in social sciences striving for the same exactness as contemporary physics, because the perfect precision is achieved only where the discipline proves pointless, in a balance of stagnation. Economies react to changes in the same way as ecosystems do. Developed economies have resources for investments and the capacity to reform their structure. People relocate and take up new jobs. A vital faculty can, however, be wrecked by recklessly oversteering in response to severe swings. In rich ecosystems too, some species can adapt to new circumstances, but however well endowed they might be, cannot recover from extinction. Oscar Morgenstern contributed to but also criticized the mathematization of economics. Although optimization tasks are presumed to be computable, time-dependent phenomena are in fact non-deterministic. For instance, while it is possible to calculate that in the so-called para-optimal situation, the position of one person cannot be improved without worsening the position of someone else, the pathway to that balance is impossible to figure out. The non-determinate character of optimization is also revealed in the question of whether purchasing reveals preferences. Indeed it does, but the purchasing also changes the preferences. As a person follows forces, those forces are modified by the person's actions. This means that when the same commodities are bought in a different order, the outcomes will be different. This accords with our own experience. At any time, our means to buy depend on the past purchases. In a scientific enterprise, the standard procedure is to reduce the number of variables in order to find the significance of the remaining ones. A reduction is taken to extreme yields insignificant results, as the object of study has then been disconnected from all else that matters. Morges then deplores modern science more broadly than mere economics by maintaining that it's often easier to mathematize an incorrect image than to face reality.
What is going on in the economy?
The resource-depleting flows of the world economy have swollen by now to immense dimensions and departed dramatically from the organic and resource-depositing flows of the earth. Clearly, our goal should be a sustainable economy where synthetic materials circulate in the same way as natural products circulate in the biosphere by the power of sunlight. Rather than extracting resources from Earth's crust, we should deposit supplies for future in the same manner that organic material fossilized in petroleum a long time ago. This change toward a sustainable way of life is underway, whether we want it or not. It's driven by the many factors, particularly by natural forces. At best, we will adapt to the reuse of resources. At worst, we are heading for a collapse. The course of humanity rests not only on economic issues, but on our culture, collective identity, and values. In short, on our worldview in its entirety. Why do companies exist? Ronald Coase was already exploring this profound question of economics in 1937. In his publication, The Nature of the Firm, the British economist argued that the division of labor in and among companies improves the overall efficiency. The optimal form of cooperation depends on the nature of the business. The economic theory speaks in terms of economics, the thermodynamic theory in holistic terms. The economy is, in a sense, an energy transaction network where workers, firms, and alliances play the same role as cells, organisms, and biotic communities in an ecosystem. This hierarchy of system is machinery that mediates flows of quanta, irrespective of whether the imbalance is in the form of money, natural resources, sunlight, or other assets. The best players are those who make most of the limited resources in the least time sense. The flows of quanta naturally select them as mediators of free energy consumption. Therefore, business moves where the demand is strongest, and a species spreads to where the food is most readily available. A suppressed demand, like a dam brook, will ultimately find its outlet. The entry of a new agent into a market is comparable to the appearance of an alien species in an ecosystem. It will prosper, provided that the flows of cash and other forms of quanta are diverted from the established agent to the newcomer. While it is hard to get a foothold in an advanced market, the opening of a closed system offers a window of opportunity for many. Similarly, the ecosystem of relatively isolated islands are highly susceptible to invasions. When the brown tree snake landed on Guam Island on board of American warships in 1950s, the island's abundant birdlife was greatly impoverished. Similarly, a transnational cooperation eats away traditional companies. It is next to impossible to foil the invasion of alien species. Still, the balance can be regained when the original players differentiate into other tasks or develop into viable competitors. We do not necessarily oppose changes, we might even welcome them, but only when we relate an unknown process to a familiar one, we will understand what could happen, for example, from the opening up of markets and their deregulation, from technological innovations, as well as from revision of the worldview. The grand regularity of data justifies the drawing of parallels across scales and disciplines. In a versatile economy, just in a vibrant ecosystem, there are many alternative flows of quanta. Such a resilient system not only adapts to changes, but can influence and even oppose them for a while whereas an economy based on essentially a single industry, just like a monoculture, is without options, and therefore it will not last for long in an economic squeeze. The tough question is, of course, how the economy can diversify to make it more robust. It is a chicken and egg situation. A system that holds ingredients and mechanisms can garner more ingredients and assemble more mechanisms. According to economics, we aim at maximizing utility. Although it is quite difficult to define utility, this may not be an issue in our new worldview, since the outcomes of economic activity are like those of other activities. Economic growth follows an S-shaped curve. The distribution of assets are skewed. By all accounts, economic decision-making is motivated by plain forces, just as other events are driven by free energy, rather than by ambiguous utility. When decision-making is beset by a conflict of forces, it might be difficult to sense which force will be the most significant in the long run. To avoid paralyzing indecisiveness, we tend to concentrate on some aspects and ignore others. The sheer focus on a single issue distorts our image of the world, as functional imaging studies of the brain have revealed. In behavioral economics, this subjective view is called cognitive bias. The very word bias tells us that others have different opinion, or that our subsequent assessment differs from the earlier impression. Remarkably, when supported by a community of fellow believers, we are wont to take an authorized allegation at face value, however absurd they might be.
People want an authority to tell them how to value things, but they choose this authority not based on facts or results. They choose it because it seems authoritative and familiar, and I'm not and never have been familiar.
Wrote Dr. Michael Burry, that's Christian Bale, to investors at the end of the film Big Short. In changes of the worldview, as in financial crisis, beliefs are likewise exposed as groundless.
What are values?
Our values are reflected in our beliefs of right and wrong, good and evil, beautiful and ugly, desirable and detestable. The essential values and changes in values have traditionally engaged philosophers, anthropologists, psychologists, and sociologists, but seldom physicists. Now the thermodynamic theory allows us to examine the essence of values, just like other things. Values are subjective. One person can see the same thing as worthy, while another one as worthless, as the two differ in their relations to it. By spelling out the nature of subjectivity, it might seem as if the thermodynamic theory would imply that the values are relative. This is not the case. Values are not of equal value. The values of one person can be compared with those of another, even precisely in the universal terms of energy. In practice, we look for a more comprehensive evaluation by bringing the matter to the public or putting it in the hands of experts. In the same way, the value of a product is rated on the market and the significance of mutation is tested in nature. However, there is no way to get an undistorted evaluation, for the evaluation itself leaves neither the matter nor the evaluator unaffected. But being aware of the subjective nature of our perceptions, we at least know to ask for versatile and verifiable accounts to weigh various forces. Our values evolved as we became aware of new forces. So today, democracy is valued as an effective mechanism in pooling and channeling resources, which are ultimately all free energy. After all, democracy displays the grand regularity in its voting statistics, which follow power laws. Democracy means equality, the search for truth, respect for opposing party, cooperation with political opponents, as well as respect for pluralism. These are powerful mechanisms altogether to draw means of living from diverse resources. Ecological and environmental values, in turn, sum up evolutionary history, which has granted us our living conditions. And the values of science express the wisdom needed to comprehend reality. The wider the world of values is, the greater the forces that are respected therein. All in all, in defending values, we defend the capital of history. Values enrich in interactions in the same way that the economy grows in transactions. The growth opens new opportunities for growth. It is exemplary of self-sustaining growth process where motion influences motive forces. As the unpredictable chain of events unfolds, people are exposed to new interactions. Morality matures as they get to know others' perspectives and relate them to their own. Correspondingly, when an individual or a community turns inward, shuts itself off, the values become impoverished. As everything affects everything else, the values explain the circumstances, and the values can be explained by the circumstances. Maupertuis already explained the various matters with the same principle. Nevertheless, it may still take quite some time before we are poised to see ourselves the way we see other things. In that worldview, every one of us, the whole society and culture, are just mechanisms for making things happen. This naturalistic interpretation essentially expresses functionalism, familiar from social science, in terms of energy and time. The French sociologist Émile Durkheim saw society as an organism in the same way as Lovelock saw the whole earth as an organism. Today, we can extend this all-inclusive reasoning to the foundations of existence, down to the single quantum. Comprehension to the destiny of humankind can be drawn from the answers to Paul Gauguin's three questions. Where do we come from? Well, we are products of the past, irreversible evolution along the lines of force. What are we? Well, we are ancient among other agents, materialization of the universal law of nature. Where are we going? Well, we orient along the lines of force to explore unknown, to intensify our activities, and eventually to realize that we are part of the earth rather than living on the face of it. Nicholas Maxwell's reasoned that providing answers to the questions about us and our place in this world is the whole purpose of science. But today, the meaning is lost as the unity of nature is reduced in detached details. The ever more specialized research in our age failed to process knowledge into wisdom, whereas our own experience of time and existence, when mathematized with Galileo's method, marshaled physics to embrace a unified view of space, time, matter, and life, and all of that within us. Finally, our aim, as well as that of the ancient philosophers, has been achieved. The general principle that brings both our everyday experience and scientific experiments into a logical order has been found. We can describe atoms, people, societies, and galaxies in the same manner. This understanding does not devalue us, but places us within the full spectrum of existence.